There is a name that many Turkish families carry without knowing what it actually preserves. Not a title, not a decoration, a signal buried in syllables passed down for centuries, long before anyone thought to ask what it meant or where it truly came from. For generations, the story felt settled. A surname was simply a surname, a marker of family, of region, of trade, of faith. Nothing more. Then geneticists began comparing the DNA of modern Anatolian families to the deep genomic record of the region, and the tidy story of who these names actually belonged to began to complicate. Because the accepted history said something simple: Turkish surnames trace back to the Seljuks and later the Ottomans, warrior dynasties who swept out of Central Asia and reshaped Anatolia in their image. The names, the language, the culture, all threads leading back to the steppe. But the genome does not always agree with the story a name seems to tell. What researchers began finding quietly, patiently, across thousands of samples, was a population whose ancestry ran far deeper and far stranger than the Seljuk narrative alone could explain. A population where names spoke of one origin and chromosomes whispered of several. This is the story of what 15 ancient surname traditions may actually be hiding, and why the DNA underneath the Turkish family tree turned out to be so much older and so much more layered than almost anyone expected. If stories like this interest you, subscribe, because there is far more hidden in the human past than most of us realize. For most of the last 1,000 years, the accepted history of Anatolia has followed a clean arc. In the 11th century, Turkic-speaking peoples from Central Asia, the Oghuz Confederation, ancestors of the Seljuks, moved westward across the steppe and into the highlands of Anatolia. They defeated Byzantine forces at Manzikert in 1071, and over the following centuries, Turkic language, Islam, and eventually Ottoman rule spread across a landscape that had belonged, for thousands of years before that, to Greeks, Armenians, Assyrians, Hittites, and a dozen other ancient peoples. Surnames, in the modern sense, arrived even later. It was not until the 20th century, under the Turkish Republic's 1934 surname law, that most families were required to formally adopt them. Many chose names rooted in Old Turkic words, words for strength, for sky, for wolf, for iron, for mountain, for the horse cultures of the steppe. Names like Yildiz, Demir, Aslan, Kaya, Bozkurt, and dozens of others were meant to anchor modern Turkish identity to that ancient Central Asian inheritance. It made sense. A young nation, reaching backward for an origin story that felt strong, continuous, and proud. The Seljuks and the Oghuz Turks were the obvious ancestors. The names were chosen to honor that lineage. For decades, that was the story and it seemed complete. But historians and linguists had noticed something odd long before geneticists ever got involved. The Turkic language had spread across Anatolia almost completely. And yet, the physical and cultural traces of the pre-Turkic populations, the Greeks, the Armenians, the Anatolian farming communities that had lived in that landscape for over 8,000 years, had not simply vanished. Churches became mosques. Village names shifted, but sometimes echoed older, non-Turkic roots. Byzantine field terraces, water systems, and settlement patterns were absorbed rather than erased. This is the first crack in the story. A full language replacement, but not obviously a full population replacement. Historians began to ask a quiet but important question. If an entire land shifted its tongue, its faith, and its names, did its people actually change, or did the deeper population simply survive underneath a new identity? Oral tradition and elite chronicles told one story, of Turkic warriors and their descendants populating the land. But the archaeological record hinted at something messier: continuity of settlement, continuity of agriculture, continuity of certain material culture, layered beneath the new Turkic and Islamic surface. This is where the surname question becomes more than curiosity. Because if a name like Aslan or Bozkurt genuinely reflected direct, unbroken descent from Central Asian Oghuz warriors, we would expect it to show up alongside a strong, consistent Central Asian genetic signature. If, instead, it reflected a symbolic choice, a name adopted to express identity rather than literal bloodline, the genome underneath might tell a very different story. This is where DNA enters, not as a footnote, but as the turning point in the investigation. Modern population genetics works with several different kinds of evidence, and each reveals something different. Autosomal DNA, inherited from both parents and mixed each generation, reveals the broad genetic ancestry of a population as a whole, showing what proportion of a group's genome. Traces to different ancestral sources. Y chromosome DNA, passed almost unchanged from father to son, preserves a record of paternal lineages stretching back many generations, useful for tracing exactly the kind of warrior descent line the Seljuk migration story implies. Mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, tells a separate, often surprisingly different story about maternal ancestry. When researchers began sequencing and comparing genomes from modern Anatolian Turkish populations against ancient DNA recovered from Bronze Age and Iron Age Anatolian skeletons, against Byzantine-era remains, and against genetic data from modern Central Asian Turkic-speaking populations, they were essentially asking the genome to settle what history and archaeology could only gesture toward. The results did not simply confirm the Seljuk origin story. And they did not simply erase it either. What emerged instead was a population whose overall autosomal ancestry was overwhelmingly continuous with the ancient inhabitants of Anatolia, the same deep genetic layer connected to Bronze Age Hittite-era populations, and further back, to the Neolithic farming communities who had lived in the region since the dawn of agriculture. Multiple genomic studies comparing modern Turkish samples to ancient Anatolian remains have found that the majority of the autosomal genome in modern Turkish populations traces back to this deep, local Anatolian and Eastern Mediterranean ancestry, not to Central Asia. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. Because layered within that overwhelmingly local genetic base, researchers also detected something else, a real, measurable but comparatively modest genetic contribution associated with Central and Inner Asian ancestry, the kind of signal consistent with the historical Turkic migrations. Some studies have estimated this Central Asian-related component in modern Turkish populations at a modest percentage of the overall genome, varying by region, with somewhat higher traces detected on certain paternal Y chromosome lineages than in the autosomal genome as a whole. In other words, the story did not collapse. It widened. The Seljuk and Oghuz migrations were real. The Central Asian genetic signal is real, and it is measurable. But it arrived not as a total replacement of an existing population, but as a layer, a new thread woven into a genetic tapestry that was already thousands of years deep, already shaped by Hittites, Phrygians, Greeks, Armenians, Persians, and countless earlier movements across one of the most crossed landscapes on Earth. At this point, researchers had to weigh several possible explanations for what the data was showing. The first explanation is elite dominance with population continuity, a relatively smaller number of Turkic-speaking warriors and administrators arriving, intermarrying, and imposing language, religion, and naming customs on a much larger existing population, whose descendants make up the genetic bulk of modern Anatolia. The second explanation involves layered, centuries-long admixture, not a single migration event, but waves of contact, intermarriage, and cultural exchange across the Seljuk period, the subsequent Beylik era, and the long span of Ottoman rule, during which populations from the Balkans, the Caucasus, and the Middle East were also continuously folded into the Anatolian genetic mix. The third explanation is what some researchers describe as symbolic naming without proportional ancestry, the idea that many 20th century surname choices, particularly those referencing wolves, mountains, iron, and the steppe, were selected to express a chosen national identity rather than to reflect an individual family's actual genetic descent. Under this model, a name like Bozkurt does not certify Central Asian bloodline any more than an American surname like Freeman certifies descent from a particular founding family. It reflects meaning, aspiration, and belonging, not a genetic paper trail. The evidence so far suggests all three forces were likely at work, in different proportions, in different regions, across different families. The most important turning point in this investigation came from studies combining ancient DNA recovered directly from archaeological sites, including pre-Turkic Byzantine and Roman-era burials in Anatolia, with large modern comparative datasets spanning Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia. This is a far more powerful method than looking at modern DNA alone, because ancient genomes act as a fixed reference point in time, allowing researchers to measure genetic change and continuity with much greater precision. These comparisons confirmed what smaller studies had hinted at for years: the genetic transition in Anatolia across the era of Turkic migration and Ottoman formation was gradual and layered, not a single sharp replacement. The core ancestry of the region persisted. A real, but partial, Central Asian genetic signature was added on top of it, concentrated in some lineages more than others, uneven across geography, uneven across families. And here is the twist that reframes the entire question of the 15 ancient surnames. Many families carrying deeply Turkic-rooted names: Yildiz, Demir, Aslan, Kaplan, Bozkurt, Aydin, Karaca, Kurt, Dogan, Sahin, Arslan, Timur, Toprak, Bulut, and Erdogan, among the most historically resonant, are not, on average, genetically distinguishable in any dramatic way from families carrying names rooted in Byzantine, Armenian, or older Anatolian linguistic traditions. The surname often reflects identity, language, and choice far more precisely than it reflects a documented, unbroken bloodline to the Central Asian steppe. Not every name tells the ancestry story you would expect. Not even close. Some families with steppe-themed surnames do carry a stronger-than-average Central Asian genetic signal, particularly along the paternal line, a real echo of Seljuk and Oghuz descent preserved through Y chromosome inheritance. But many others, statistically, carry genomes that are almost indistinguishable from neighbors whose surnames reference entirely different heritages. The genome, in this sense, did not simply confirm the name. It complicated it, layered it, and in many cases quietly rewrote what the name was assumed to prove. The surprise was not that Turkish identity contains Central Asian ancestry. Historians already knew that. The surprise was how thin that thread often is when measured against the deep, continuous Anatolian genetic base beneath it, and how much of what people assumed was bloodline was, in fact, culture, language, and chosen meaning layered generation after generation on top of a population that had never fully left. This matters far beyond one country's family trees. It matters because it reveals something true about nearly every population on Earth. Identity and ancestry are not the same thing. A surname, a flag, a language, a faith, these are powerful, real, meaningful forces that shape who a people become. But they are not always a precise map of biological descent. Populations migrate, conquer, intermarry, absorb, and transform. Genes move independently of language. Language moves independently of genes. And somewhere underneath both, older populations often persist far longer than the history books admit. Picture, for a moment, the high plateau of central Anatolia at dusk, the Cappadocian rock formations glowing amber, carved dwellings that predate Islam by 1,000 years standing quiet beside newer villages. Somewhere beneath that soil are the bones of Hittite farmers, Byzantine monks, Seljuk horsemen, and Ottoman soldiers, layered like sediment, each generation building on top of the last without ever fully erasing what came before. The wind moves the same way it moved for all of them. The genome carries the same layered patience, not a single clean line, but a slow, accumulated record of every people who ever paused long enough in that landscape to leave a trace. That is what a name like Bozkurt or Aslan or Yildiz is quietly standing on top of, not a myth and not a lie, but a story far older and far more mixed than the 20th century choice to wear it as identity. If you found this kind of layered, evidence-driven history compelling, subscribe, because almost every population on Earth is hiding a story like this one, waiting for the right kind of evidence to bring it to the surface. In the end, the DNA did not take the Seljuk story away from Turkish identity. It did something more interesting. It placed that story inside a much larger one, a landscape that has been continuously inhabited, continuously mixed, and continuously renamed for thousands of years, long before any surname law, and long before any single migration could claim to define an entire people. The 15 ancient surname traditions carried by millions of families today are not lies. They are not myths either. They are monuments, chosen, meaningful, and partly true, standing on top of a genetic foundation that is older, deeper, and far more layered than the name alone could ever reveal. The map of who we are was never going to be simple. Anatolia just happens to be one of the clearest places on Earth where the genome finally said so. Want to be notified when Claude responds? Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.